I didn't ruin my life with one terrible decision. I ruined it by making hundreds of small, reasonable ones. That's the part nobody warns you about. If you ask people how they lost themselves, they'll often point to something dramatic, a mistake, a betrayal, a moment they wish they could undo. My story doesn't have that. No explosion. No scandal. No single day I can circle and say, this is where everything went wrong. My life slipped away quietly, while I was busy being sensible. I chose the safe option when the risky one scared me. I chose stability when passion felt irresponsible. I chose approval when honesty threatened to complicate things. And every time, it felt like the mature thing to do. At first, it even worked. I built a life that looked solid from the outside. A job people respected. A routine that functioned. A future that could be explained without hesitation. People told me I was doing well. I started believing them because it was easier than listening to the part of me that felt strangely absent. I remember the first time I noticed the silence inside. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my screen, completing a task I could do without thinking. Someone congratulated me on a small success. I smiled. I thanked them. And felt nothing. No pride. No excitement. Just relief that nothing had gone wrong. That's when it began, not the regret, but the numbness. I told myself this was adulthood. That fulfillment was overrated. That peace mattered more than desire. The problem was, I didn't feel peaceful either. I felt neutral. Days blended together in a way that didn't feel tragic, just forgettable. Weeks passed without leaving a mark. I stopped anticipating the future and started managing it instead. Whenever doubt surfaced, I silenced it with logic. This job pays the bills. This relationship makes sense. This path is sustainable. What I never asked was whether it was mine. There was a version of me once who wanted things intensely. Not necessarily grand things, just meaningful ones. That version dreamed loudly, argued passionately, felt deeply. I didn't kill that version. I negotiated with him. I told him, later. When it's safer. When it's easier. When it won't disrupt everything. He waited longer than he should have. The first real crack came years later, in a moment that should have felt happy. I achieved something I had worked toward for a long time. People celebrated me. Messages poured in. Praise followed. That night, alone, I sat on the edge of my bed and felt an unfamiliar weight in my chest. Not sadness. Grief. Not for something I lost, but for something I never allowed myself to become. I realized then that success doesn't hurt when it's empty. It just echoes. I began to notice how often I used the word fine. How rarely I used the word alive. When people asked if I was happy, I didn't lie. I just answered a different question. Comfort is dangerous because it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like a reward. It cushions you from risk. It dulls the sharp edges of fear. And slowly, it dulls everything else too. I stayed because leaving would have required explaining myself. To family. To colleagues. To a version of me I had carefully constructed. Explaining felt harder than enduring. So I endured. Years passed. Not dramatically efficiently. I aged in increments of responsibility. Promotions replaced dreams. Stability replaced curiosity. And one evening, standing in line at a grocery store, holding items I always bought, listening to music I barely heard, I felt it clearly for the first time: this life will end exactly the way it is now. No collapse. No awakening. Just continuation. That thought terrified me more than failure ever had. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because something inside me had finally stopped cooperating. The questions I had postponed returned, louder than before. What if this isn't a phase? What if this is the life I chose and keep choosing every day? I understood then that regret doesn't come from choosing wrong once. It comes from choosing what feels easiest until you wake up in a life that feels foreign. I hadn't betrayed anyone else. But I had quietly betrayed myself. And the worst part was realizing I had done it willingly. After that night, I started paying attention to the small ways my life resisted me. Nothing broke. Nothing demanded change. That was the cruelty of it. Every morning still arrived on time. My job still needed me. People still recognized my name, my face, my role. But something inside me had shifted from cooperation to quiet protest. I began noticing how often I postponed my own desires with phrases that sounded responsible. Now isn't the right time. I should be grateful. It could be worse. Those sentences had once protected me from fear. Now they felt like excuses rehearsed for too long. I tried to fix the feeling the way sensible people do. I optimized my routine. I exercised more. I traveled when I could. I bought things meant to make life feel fuller. Nothing touched the emptiness. Because the emptiness wasn't boredom. It was misalignment. I was living a life that made sense on paper, but not in my body. The moral dilemma grew slowly. It wasn't about whether to stay or leave. It was about whether I had the right to want something else. I had responsibilities. People who counted on me. A past built on consistency. Walking away from that felt selfish, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet way that invites judgment. Who abandons a life that works? I did what I always did when faced with conflict, I minimized it. I told myself I was overthinking. That longing was childish. That maturity meant accepting trade-offs. But a dangerous question kept returning, no matter how I silenced it: how many years are you willing to trade for comfort? I started imagining my future in detail. Not the highlights, the average days. The same commute, the same conversations. The same evenings dissolving into screens and sleep. There was nothing wrong with that picture. And that was exactly what made it unbearable. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a glass wall downtown. I looked composed. Put together. Successful. I felt like a stranger was borrowing my body. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I realized I had been living as an observer of my own life. Participating just enough to keep things moving. Detached enough to avoid risk. Comfort hadn't destroyed me. It had paused me. The breaking point didn't arrive as despair. It arrived as clarity. I was sitting with someone who spoke passionately about a decision they had made, not a smart one, not a safe one, but a deeply personal one. They were nervous. Uncertain. Alive. I listened, smiled, offered sensible advice. And envied them more than I had ever envied anyone in my life. That envy wasn't about their choice. It was about their permission to choose at all. That night, I admitted something to myself I had avoided for years: I was afraid of disrupting a life I didn't even enjoy. Staying was no longer neutral. It was an active decision, one I was making every day. And if staying was a choice, then leaving had to be one too. That realization changed everything. For the first time, I stopped asking whether change would hurt others. Instead, I asked what staying was costing me. The answer wasn't abstract. It was time. Energy. Identity. I wasn't exhausted because life was hard. I was exhausted because it wasn't honest. The idea of starting over terrified me. Not because I might fail, but because I might finally see what I had avoided becoming. I understood then that comfort isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of avoidance. And avoidance has a cost that compounds silently. I stood in my apartment one evening, surrounded by objects chosen for practicality rather than love, and felt something shift. Not urgency. Not panic. Resolve. I didn't need a dramatic escape. I needed a deliberate departure. Not from my responsibilities but from the version of myself that had confused safety with meaning. And once that distinction became clear, comfort stopped feeling like protection. It started feeling like a cage I had politely decorated. The day I finally chose discomfort, nothing extraordinary happened. No one argued with me. No door slammed. No life collapsed. That's how I knew the choice was real. I didn't announce my decision. I simply stopped renewing the life I had outgrown. I declined things I once accepted automatically. I questioned routines that no longer served me. I allowed silence where explanations used to live. At first, it felt wrong. Like breaking an unspoken contract. People noticed changes, but they didn't understand them. They asked if I was tired. If something was wrong. I told them the truth in the only way that felt safe: I'm reevaluating. That word gave me space. Leaving comfort wasn't dramatic, it was disorienting. Without the familiar structure, I felt exposed. Unprotected. There were nights when I missed the predictability of my old life. Not because it fulfilled me but because it numbed me. Discomfort wakes you up. And being awake isn't always pleasant. I faced parts of myself I had avoided for years. The ambitions I buried. The anger I redirected into compliance. The grief for time already spent. I had to accept that I wouldn't get those years back. No apology could restore them. No reinvention could erase them. But I could stop losing more. That realization grounded me. Starting over didn't feel like rebirth. It felt like responsibility. Every choice now belonged to me without the shelter of habit. Failure would be mine. So would meaning. I learned that regret doesn't disappear when you change direction. It becomes quieter, less accusatory. Instead of asking, why didn't you, it asks, what will you do now? That question felt heavier, but fairer. Some people drifted away. Not out of anger, out of misalignment. They didn't recognize me without my predictability. And I didn't blame them. Comfort had made me easy to understand. Discomfort made me honest. There were moments when fear returned, whispering that I had ruined something good. But then I remembered how good had felt: safe, efficient, empty. I wasn't chasing happiness. I was choosing presence. Life didn't suddenly become meaningful. Meaning isn't something you find, it's something you tolerate building slowly. Some days were still ordinary. Some choices still uncertain. But the difference was this: I was no longer absent from them. If you're listening and wondering whether comfort is worth the quiet cost it demands, I want to tell you to leave. Not everyone needs to. But ask yourself one honest question: is comfort protecting your life or postponing it? Because I learned this too late, but not too late to matter. You don't lose your life by making the wrong decision. You lose it by avoiding decisions altogether. Choosing discomfort didn't save me. It returned me. Not to who I was, but to who I was finally willing to become. And for the first time, that feels like a life I can stand inside.